Hi, I'm Othais, and this is Webley's government model revolver, specifically what collectors know as the model of 1886. While it's a little rough around the edges, this does represent, at least externally, the first of what most people think of as the Webley Revolver. We'll explain why after we get this into the lightbox. Just clearing 2.5 pounds and with an overall length just under 11.5 inches, this is a big boy old Victorian revolver. It takes 6 cartridges, those being the Enfield Mark III, which is what most people consider to be the .476, and of course is a top break simultaneously ejecting action. Recently, a number of you have been concerned about changes to our video host's acceptable list of firearms content. While I'm sure we are not entirely welcome, this show does manage to function thanks to viewers like yourself. Consider joining us for our behind-the-scenes podcast and early proof check releases, all while making sure that we can continue our mission. And thankfully, what I have here is not a spooky gun or firearm accessory, no. It's a do-all lubricant and preservative that just so happens to be safe for wood, metal, and even human skin. Ballistol is likely older than many of the treasures that you might use it to protect, and not a single one has rotted away from its proper application. While we regularly encourage those who have not tried Ballistol to give it a shot, see what I did? I would also like to point out that we know many of you already go through this like water. So I'd just like to remind those people in the audience, you can literally purchase it by the gallon. I expect anyone buying a full-on bucket to tag both our show and Ballistol on whatever social media you use. To heck with it, I'll post appropriate photos of the gallon bucket that you might take at the end of the next episode. Alright, as for our topic today, this revolver is critically important to the history of the Webley wheel gun. That's because, if you recall, Webley is just starting to define itself as not just a manufacturer of handguns, but also a designer of the same. In previous episodes, we've covered their Royal Irish Constabulary, an early centerfire breech-loading revolver that, while well executed, had no real novelty all on its own. Rather, it was descended from a similar work by Tranter, and frankly common in the market. Plucking ideas from Belgium, Webley would beef up their line with the No. 4 revolvers, the beginnings of their obsession with rapid-loading top-break actions. Though at this point, it was fastened by 2 press levers, a modification of the Koné patent. A mix of Belgian lockwork and improved Belgian latching were found on the improved government model, more popularly known as the Kaufmann. While it started as a push button, it eventually moved to a lever-actuated release. The Kaufmann's 2-piece grips, stylized barrel assembly, top break action with a thumb lever release, really did a lot to establish the unique look of Webley & Sons, but like everything else to date, it was ultimately an amalgam of existing or licensed inventions. Towards the end of production, however, Webley did finally put down their own patent. Filed in March of 1885, this covered a seemingly novel latch mechanism. Thumb-operated, it provided a sort of stirrup which wrapped over the top strap's rearmost extension, efficiently locking the action shut with even more strength than before. The very last variation of the Kaufmann revolver was fitted with this exact latch. While we did not have an example here when recording that episode, our friend Jonathan Ferguson of the Royal Armories did. He has a lovely video on all the bits and bobs. Unrelated to the Kaufmann, however, this 1885 patent also included for the first time what seems to be a wholly original Webley & Sons lockwork, or at least I have not been able to attribute it to anyone else so far. Sadly, there are not direct records or letters explaining exactly how it was developed. The whole setup is frankly quite unusual, but we'll cover it in detail momentarily. Filing in 1886, William John Whiting, a Webley employee, was granted patent for a new anti-friction and anti-fouling configuration for both cylinder and arbor. This represents an improvement on both fronts over the existing Kaufmann. And while we're at it, take note of the front of the barrel assembly. A new contour has appeared, which finally ditches the holdover cone shape from the Koné type break opens. All of those features were rolled into a new model, what's now commonly called the model of 1886. which was of course chambered for the then government standard Enfield Mark III cartridge, popularly known in the commercial world as the 4.76. They were also available in 450 Adams. Now, of course, I happen to have a fairly early version of just that revolver here, so let's use this opportunity to take a closer look. All right, this is our Webley 1886, and even at a glance, it's going to be very familiar to that old Kaufmann. What carries over? Well, two-piece stock plates, full grip, single-piece frame. We've got this integral trigger guard. These are newer features for the Kaufmann that get passed on down to this guy. Obviously, both guns are top brakes. Both have this nice bird's beak grip. Both are single and double action, so I can cock her back and fire, or I can pull through and fire, although a double action is very smooth for reasons we'll find out in a moment. At the front, we've actually gone backwards and forwards in time. The Kaufmann had a push button release for the arbor, so with the action open, if you want to get that cylinder out, you push the button, you pull this guy free. I'll leave that in the gun for the moment. On this guy, we've wandered back to the Kone style of rotating knob, where you roll it 180, pop this guy open, and look at that, she's ready to go. If I leave it the other way, of course, it doesn't go anywhere. Just to show that in detail, arrow forward, good to go. Arrow backwards, well, she's going to come apart when you open her up. Now, this has gotten loose over time, which is probably the reason why it doesn't stay with the gun forever. It ultimately gets abandoned for a simple screw. The reason you might get rid of the button, however, is because the Kaufmann button was owned by Kaufmann, and you don't want to pay royalties on all your guns when you're no longer using some of his other features at the rear. You've moved on to this beautiful stirrup system, which actually has its roots in other designs. But first, let's look at what I'm talking about. We have a thumb latch that I can push to cock that guy open, and when I push it, she goes over. The latch itself is powered by a V-spring over here on this side of the frame. So if I push that down, you can see her flexing away. Looking from the top down, we can actually see if I open up that latch, that our top strap has a hole in it, and there's a lug on the frame that sets down into that hole, and then it's even stepped so that our latch goes right over there. This forms a very strong, almost singular piece. It is also not entirely unique to this gun. The older Tranter 1879 also has a block that rides up in there, and then the whole thing is latched together, although it's latched on the side by this lug. This was likely to avoid the Smith & Wesson patent, which as far back as our Schofield, we see a system nearly identical to Webley's, except it doesn't have the thumb latch. So if you were to combine a Schofield with this thumb operation, you'd pretty much have the Webley design. I'm a little bit surprised that they were able to patent it as a novelty, because it really is just combining two existing technologies. Now, Webley's system also prevents you from having an out-of-battery fire, because if this isn't all the way down, your latch will be held back and the hammer will collide with it. However, if we have the hammer all the way down, we can still open the latch. So unlike the last of the Kaufmanns, well, the almost last of the Kaufmanns, because the last of the Kaufmanns used this latch, unlike the Kaufmann safety system, this does not prevent blow open, although the system should avoid it just because of its natural assembly. Now I've gone ahead and taken this guy apart for you because although it's a side plate gun, the stirrup gets in the way. You have to pressure that spring on the other side. It's a whole thing and a bit beyond our scope for telling you exactly how to take it apart. We just want to see how it works. Well, in this case, we have a V mainspring that is powering the hammer on one side with no stirrup, very Swiss worn, you know. And then we have an arm down here that wraps around the hammer and provides power to the trigger. It also acts as the rebound for the hammer. This we're very familiar with. This extension off the hammer meets a little shelf on that arm. That makes this a rebound arm. So our mainspring tension on release, that's down in this lower tine, is going to push that hammer back more so than this upper tine is pushing it forward at that moment. That gives us our good rebound. It also is a sort of hammer block in that this toe off the bottom of the hammer cannot go this way, so the hammer can't go that way until we pull the trigger and lift this out of the path of the hammer. So good safety feature. Now, what gets weird is basically how insane this trigger is. We pull down here, which wraps up this way. Then we have a scallop this way to seal up the bottom of the action so nothing gets in there, but that's all it's really doing because this twirl that goes up towards the axis pin then snakes back around and pops up once more in order to connect to the hand, which serves, the pin off the hand serves as the access point for the dog, which we'll see in a moment. The mainspring's extending arm goes ahead and hits that stirrup. That stirrup is pinned somewhere up in here-ish. Therefore, you have this big wrap around before you hit the stirrup, which means a lot of leverage and very smooth transition and double action. So this setup with the stirrup really makes that spring stack very evenly as much as possible. And you can even see it, look at it tuck into that crevice just right. That is utterly wild. I mean, look at the shape of that trigger. It's super bizarre, and we'll see it better in our animation as well. Now the hand does what hands do. It pushes the cylinder around in a circle. We've seen this enough that you guys aren't going to be surprised. If you try to look behind the hand, you might be able to make out the dog, although frankly that's going to be a bit easier to see in the animation. It has a sort of like extending palm and then sort of cleat at the bottom in order to engage the entire hammer on this breast. If I keep pushing that back, you'll see, and I know it's a struggle, folks, but you'll see it way better in the animation. You'll see that that little palm extension is designed to naturally pull this out away from the hammer in a nice smooth rotary motion. Sorry, that's very difficult for my hands. It's to do it in a nice smooth rotary motion so that the break in double action is very, very clean. Single action is simply that we cock back and we meet at a spot that frankly you guys can't even see up under that hand. Well, I'm so glad we have Brew in our animator. Way down in there, if you turn back to our Kaufmann episode, you'll see the 2-position cylinder stops that we saw last time. So we have a locking bolt there, and then we have a cylinder stop off the top of the trigger. That should be familiar from the Kaufmann. Again, I'll defer the animation because I guarantee you this is difficult for you guys to make out. While we're here though, I will go ahead and spell out the seal at the front of the cylinder and therefore covering the arbor. So our arbor is here, down in there. The whole thing actually does come out. It's a split system just like we saw in the previous gun, but we now have an extension off of this sort of barrel assembly that goes fairly deeply into the front of the cylinder and therefore is a pretty big barrier to allowing any dirt or muck to get into the arbor's path, which would naturally make the revolver much stiffer to handle. Boy, you got to get that alignment just right to put that back together. Any sort of resistance on that rotation is going to really stack when you're down here. So as much as you can keep it clean, it means that you're going to have a smoother, lighter trigger. And that is, I mean, that's ball bearing smooth. I don't hear a single sound from this gun, and it really cooks up when I spin it. So good job to Webley on that one. Now, the earliest examples of this new Webley Revolver actually use the same extraction system of the previous Kaufmann and later number 4s, wherein a spring-loaded rotating chock retained the lifter until it was compressed by lobes on the hinge point, releasing the extractor so that it can spring back into place. An improved system entered production just ahead of my example here. Well, theoretically improved. Mine and some others seem to have broken over the years. The old system had everything you see here, a lifter, an axis pin, you have a frame, and you had a barrel assembly with, this piece of metal here. That system also had a plunger and spring powering a chock, which was a flapper that had to be held in with a set of screws. And then you also had to have carefully machined lobes instead of just this nice round shape on this guy in order to get the whole thing to work. The new system is what you see here, and it's dead simple. You have a lifter with an oblong opening instead of just a round circle, which allows it to transition up or down. So this would be, say, the down position, and then this would be the up position. Now, this system should have a flat spring sitting in this groove. Unfortunately, mine is broken off, and it's not really much of a surprise. Look how incredibly fine that is. The first person to take this apart probably sent it flying without realizing it. Now, with this system, the flat spring would have always pushed this down into the lower position, where it would have run into this abutment on the frame. It's not even specially shaped, it's just the frame. When it ran into that, it would stop its rotation. Therefore, the chock is part of the lifter in this case. And that would have meant as we opened it relative to the barrel assembly, this little guy would have kept going up and pushing out our extractor. Now, whenever the thing finally gets fully open, the frame and barrel assembly meet, and yeah, there's no room for anything in there. And so if our guy were where he belongs, inside of there, this round head here of that little notch would have been pushed in, therefore going to the up position, compressing the spring, and that would have released this guy to snap back down. So that means when we open this guy up, we can simultaneously eject all of our cartridges, and when these two pieces meet and squeeze that guy out, she snaps right on back in. The same system that we've seen before, or at least the same results we've seen before, with a much simplified operation. The removal of at least 3 parts in a very complicated machining process, I'm sure. Now, unfortunately, I can't seem to pair this extraction system with a patent under Webley's control. Filing in March of 1886, George Fox secured a US patent for a very similar arrangement, though this same system was claimed in various configurations by Andrew Freiberg as well. His earliest was from January of 1886, using an internal spring. Though over time he'd file a whole series of these simplified chock and lifter mechanisms, which were assigned to the Ivor Johnson Company. It's likely, however, that Webley was already in the process of using this extractor system before that filing. I cannot seem to find a British patent which corresponds at all. I suspect it either wasn't patented, was rejected for a patent, or perhaps is hiding in some sort of break-action shotgun patent which I've yet to encounter. Serial numbers for the 1886 range between roughly 1,460 and 1,880, likely indicating only a few hundred made. Given the number of adjustments, you might even consider it something of a transitional model. Now, another change would come to the 1886 after my example here was produced. However, we'll actually be able to see that on the very next model as well. Before we get there, however, I'm happy to say that in spite of the problems with the extractor on this piece, we still managed to get it out to the range and let Mae take some shots with it. You know, if I hadn't explained every little detail, could you really have spotted that this was something other than a service Webley when Mae was shooting it? Yeah, this model was pretty influential, but of course, improvements did not stop, and soon there were enough piled up to warrant a whole other model, or perhaps Webley just started marketing those changes in a new model and they wanted a more up-to-date number. Regardless, what I have here now is Webley's government model of 1889. You might even be able to read that off the side of the top strap when I shove it in the light box. Our weight has held roughly the same, although we have managed to squeak up to an 11 3/4 inch total length due to the particular barrel on this example. Now, those lengths can vary, so this isn't true of every model of 1889. The chambering is still roughly the same, 6 cartridges, usually in an Enfield Mark III chambering just at the cusp of this thing being released. However, that was changing, as on the military side, the 4.55 Webley cartridge had appeared. Now, thankfully, this example has everything we need to fully explore the differences between it and the 1886, so let's go ahead and just get a closer look. Alright, this looks radically different from our previous model in some ways, and yet none of them matter, because frankly, they're not really the reason this is an 89 versus the other one being the 86. Now, the mechanical difference between the two that we've seen is right here, this screw head, which is how we released the arbor. It was, however, instituted before they started marking these model 1889, so technically the 86 could have this. Instead of that 180 degree, we just put a coin in that slot, rotator all the way out. I don't have a coin, but my screwdriver will have to do while I sweat destroying the most beautiful bluing I've ever seen on a firearm in this show. And yes, it does appear to be original, as there's no sign of any rounding of the original markings. If somebody reblued this, they did a genius job. You know what? That probably needs another pass after firing that black powder. So let's go ahead and pull this guy out. And looky looky, we've got a pin with the threading right up by the cap, only a couple turns to get her free. And of course it's textured so that you can get a hold of it with your fingers. Start that thread on your own before setting the first and last with the coin. The grip probably stands out as fairly different. We have sort of a bell shape coming to the rear instead of that bird's head that we saw earlier. This little addition was actually an upcharge. It was considered a target style grip, although as you can see, this doesn't have target sights or an unnecessarily long barrel. They just have the grips. And it's not uncommon to find these fitted to these Webley W.Gs. They only cost 6 shillings extra, and they were actually put on the frame as requested before final finishing, which means the entire frame was not milled this way. If you look very closely, you can see the seam right there where the original frame was cut and this was attached in its place. The same seam is here, just ahead of the lanyard ring. There we go, that's a little easier to make out. So this entire back strap is new, and the grips would have been fitted to the gun before bluing, and it was very nicely blued. The only real mechanical difference in this gun is actually hidden in here, and it's in such fine condition, I don't want to dig for it. We'll just show it in the animation in a moment. But that flat spring that was missing from our 86 because it broke off was replaced with a much more reliable, very tiny coil spring that sits in the exact same position, so you don't have to use a lot of imagination. And like I said, we'll see it in a moment. Really, I doubt collectors would have recognized the 89 from the 86 if it weren't for the fact that they went ahead and marked it on the top strap, W.G. model of 1889, so at least we knew something had happened. Given that this is what I would call the best of the first half of the W.G. series, I passed this revolver along as a sample to our animator Bruno. So let's finally get a good look at how this thing works.
Webley's new latch is a model of efficiency. To open the revolver, just depress the lower paddle with your thumb, and the upper end of the latch tips back, freeing the top strap so that we can break the action open. Now we can load our 6 rounds and simply snap it back shut, as the top strap is shaped to cam the latch out of the way. The lockwork definitely looks busy, but don't worry, we'll go piece by piece, starting with the trigger. The shape is fairly complex, but that's because the trigger is responsible for a number of operations. Currently, it's at rest, sprung forward by the mainspring via this transfer arm. The connection is fairly unique, as the arm is hooked at the end in order to snag a hanging stirrup attached to the inside of the cavity of the trigger. And attached to the trigger is the hand. When we pull the trigger, the hand rises, rotating the cylinder. The trigger is also responsible for halting the cylinder, thanks to this blade-like cylinder stop fitted at its top. With the trigger pulled, the stop catches in one of the 6 scallops in the cylinder wall. When the trigger is released, the stop is rotated back into the frame and out of the path of the cylinder. Counter-rotation of the cylinder upon trigger release is prevented by the same locking bolt found in the latter Kaufmann revolvers. This bolt is powered by its own flat spring and is tipped by a pin off of the hammer. Let's just watch that in action while we're back here. The hammer, by the way, is driven by the mainspring. For single action operation, we just need to manually thumb the hammer back. An extension off the bottom of the hammer has collided with an extension from the trigger, dragging both into contact at a small sear notch. This delicate interlocked point just needs the slightest pressure from the trigger to release the hammer. The lower mainspring also powers this aforementioned arm, which, yes, resets the trigger. However, it also rebounds the hammer. When the trigger is pulled, the arm rises, making room for the hammer to later drop. When we release the trigger, the arm collides with the back of the lower hammer extension, tipping it forward, and therefore the upper arm of the hammer back, rebounding our lock automatically. For double action fire, of course, we need a dog, a temporary mechanical connection between the trigger and hammer. In this system, the dog is hinged on the trigger's rearmost extension, held in place by the hand's pin. It also shares a flat spring with that same hand. Working much like a reversed hand, pulling the trigger drives the dog into the hammer's breast. While the hammer is driven back, the dog loses engagement thanks to a finger-like extension. Beyond its engagement notch, eventually, the dog slips free and the hammer falls. So while it might seem complex, hopefully the lockwork makes sense, as each operation is fairly straightforward. Since we've fired every cartridge, it's time to ditch the casings. We'll accomplish this with the help of the lifter lever, fixed to the hinge point of the revolver. The lifter is fitted with its own form of locomotion. Back on the 1886, this was a flat spring, but it was soon replaced with a coil spring and tipping plunger. This pressure keeps the lever biased outwards, towards the gap in the frame created when the system is closed. In this position, the chock, a sear-like tooth fixed to the lifter, is exposed and, if we open the action, it will strike the frame, preventing the lifter from rotating. Eventually, the barrel extension and frame meet, squeezing the chock, and thereby pressing the lifter back inside. This allows the lifter to rotate once more. Let's reset and do that again. Now focus on the extractor this time. Responsible for engaging the rims of the casings, the extractor star is fixed to a central rod. Wrapped around that is a coil spring, which keeps the extractor flush against the back of the cylinder. As we open the action, the pinned lifter drives the extractor rod out of the rear of the cylinder, thereby extracting our spent casings. Once the lifter is released, the extractor spring drives the rod back forward, snapping the extractor flush again. Alright, that should have it all covered.
Yeah, this thing is in fantastic shape, and it handles like a dream. But of course, May might think otherwise. Model 1889 serials range from about 1,980 to 3,930, given it took 2 or 3 years for the 1886 to hit a few hundred, and that the 1889 was updated again in 1891 or 92, this represents a dramatic increase in sales. That's likely because the 1889 started winning awards with various competitive shooters. Highest possible scores were achieved in Dublin, Glasgow, and the famous Wimbledon. Famed marksman Ira Payne actually shot a modified Webley W.G. 1889 in the summer of, 1889 at the National Rifle Association's Wimbledon camp, selecting it when his own handgun had been disqualified by the established rules. He obtained 3 highest possible scores, though sadly this was nearly the last event of his career, as he would pass away suddenly in Paris in September of that same year. Fun fact, Payne's modifications to the WG would actually become indirectly the cause for a lawsuit. You see, the then famed revolver marksman, C. Frederick Lowe, had written and subsequently published letters to the editors of several sporting papers. He claimed a number of problems with Webley's WG revolver. He insultingly called them copies of already available Colt, Smith & Wesson, Tranter, and Green revolvers. More on that last one in a moment. He stated that they had been in use by the Belgian government since 1871, which I have nothing to substantiate in my notes. He alleged that 2 had broken down at competitions at Nunhead and Wimbledon. The latter one was a reference to Ira Payne's own revolver. Webley sued for libel, and in June of 1890 received a judgment of some £1,000. The court decided that there was no evidence of copycatting on Webley's part. No evidence was given in defense of the broken revolver at Nunhead, whereas Ira Payne's revolver was modified outside of Webley's hands, particularly that they had filed the lockwork to a dangerous degree in search of a lighter trigger. On appeal in 1891, however, half of the claims were thrown out, and the judgment severely reduced. Curiously, what held was the libel about copycatting, which I find strange because much of the WG is frankly derivative, except probably that damned weird lockwork. What was tossed out was the claim of failure, honestly the most damning thing to Webley's business. The appeals judge felt that everything sometimes breaks down, so reporting that the guns broke down without proof of one and with known modifications of the other was just fine. I honestly don't understand this. The court filings also revealed definitive proof of a strangely debated meaning for just what WG stands for. It's definitely Webley's government revolver, which is also how they were marketed. Honestly, there are actually some ads as far back as 1883 featuring the Kaufmann improved government revolver simply being labeled Webley's government, though I think it best to keep them separated today for the sake of my sanity and yours. Some people even today believe the WG stood for Webley Green, a Cheltenham gunsmith named Edwinson Charles Green, who wrote to the Field in May of 1889, claiming to be the true inventor of Webley's stirrup latch. He stated that he designed and introduced this feature in 1883 through his own products. He goes on to say that he even improved on the design later on, making it even stronger by removing the strain from the latch's pin. Supposedly, Henry Webley had visited the Cheltenham shop in early 1885. Green alleged that he had an example in a glass case on his counter, which is where Webley likely saw it. Green had made his own fasteners with the assistance of his son Charles and a workman named Mr. Thompson. Presumably, both would back his claims that they had been in production longer than Webley's had ever appeared in the market. Even if this is all true, by his own admission, Green never filed a patent, even though he had 2 years of production before Webley even supposedly saw the latch. Webley wrote in response to Green, asking for the date of his patent, and of course, there was none, at least not for revolvers. Green had patented some shotgun locks, so he did know how and was willing to file a patent. Ultimately, there were no records which could substantiate Green's claim, just indirect suggestions. Green also claimed to have been too busy to patent the design, and also felt it might not be novel enough to warrant the expense and therefore failure of trying to patent it. That part also does ring somewhat true, as I'm still frankly surprised that the latch managed to hold a patent. Existing Green revolvers with the thumb latch stirrup also seem to lack the inset lug, which adds strength, though it is itself derivative of the Smith & Wesson. Green's patent of 1889, following the dispute, mind you, did incorporate something novel: relief cuts in the frame which matched studs on the inside of the stirrup, placing recoil strain on those larger studs and easing wear on the latch pin itself. This feature would actually come to be found on later Webley revolvers. I'm not sure if it was for this feature or perhaps some admission of guilt, but Henry Webley did, in January of 1890, give Green legal immunity from prosecution retroactively and into the future for any infringements on their patented latch, the only one to have permission that I know of. Honestly, I can't say for sure who was actually right here. Rewinding just a bit, in 1887, a WG would cost you 115 shillings blued, or 120 nickel-plated. Beginning with the 1889, a target model could be bought for 125 shillings blued, or 130 nickeled. Target sights were generally adjustable, both front and rear. In this case, the example here allows adjusting the rise for either 450 Adams or the later 455 Webley cartridge. Now, at this point in our story, we've covered Webley's first Webley revolver, at least as we understand them today, externally. Internally, however, as you saw in our own animation, the WG is very unique. Well, in between the model of 1886 and the more successful model of 1889, Webley managed to secure a government contract: the Webley Mark I service revolver, which was adopted in 1887. While externally similar, this revolver actually used a Fonyu rebounding lockwork not Webley's own W.G system. That means Webley and Son had 2 lockworks in production for quite a few years, actually. There were, however, some crossover features between the W.G and the service model. Both eventually benefited from Webley's further obsession to improve the smoothness of their revolvers. In February of 1891, William Whiting, again an employee and foreman at Webley, filed for an improved method of retaining the cylinder when the action was opened. In his new system, the cylinder and arbor were completely devoid of any interference from the catch, at least when the action was shut. However, a claw-like lever mounted on the side of the frame is cammed into contact with the cylinder when the action is opened. Now, that patent was first applied to a revolver marked W.G model of 1891. Unfortunately, only one example that I know of has ever been found. I haven't handled that example, nor have I seen it pulled apart, but I'm told it was identical to the more commonly found model of 1892. And that I do have an example of, though it's lost most of its finish over the years. Once more, our length has crept up just a tidbit, and the weight is actually slightly down. That may have to do with some internal changes that we're going to see in a moment. The cylinder still stores 6 rounds, still a top break action, and the chambering is generally 455 Webley with a backup of 476 Enfield or even 450 Adams. Now, as I just implied, the cylinder catch wasn't the only thing to change on this gun. As a matter of fact, the lockwork got a fairly big overhaul, and it is weird as all get out. Let's get a closer look. In the best of British traditions, she smells a bit, but she's got a heart of gold. This is the model 1892, and right off the bat we can see something's been added, something familiar to those of you coming from the other direction in Webley history. But first things first, let's talk about this cylinder. Look at that. Ooh, our relief cuts there, in order to lighten that sucker up, have changed from the previous models. This sort of angular shape was what a lot of people call church steeple fluting. On this case, we've got plain old round and gouged fluting, so not nearly as nice looking, but probably a lot faster and cheaper to manufacture that way. Now, the catch stands out fairly strongly, so let's go ahead and get a look at that guy. This is really a camming operation, so in its current position, the catch is down. If we cycle the revolver, you'll see she turns nice and smoothly. There's nothing impeding the cylinder. When we open her up, wait a second, why doesn't the cylinder fly free? Well, that's because even in that short little rotation, this little arm, this lever, has pressed the catch up into that little relief groove at the front of the cylinder, so it's retained. If we were to get this guy open and disengage that arm, we now have our cylinder free. And if we pull that free, we'll see, well, wait a second, our arbor is now permanently attached to the barrel assembly. It's also much thicker and stronger and lacks the cutaways that were necessary in the other design, therefore making this a lot more rigid and adding a smoother experience to our cylinder. Again, an obsession with smoothing out this revolver. From this position, we can see that less than a quarter of the circumference of our little cylinder notch is engaged by our catch. It doesn't even go through to the other side of the gun like we're used to seeing on later military models. Now, it's just enough to keep the cylinder from flying when the action is open. Now, because of the changes to the arbor, there's going to be changes to the extractor assembly, the nut at the end, the way the rod's configured. It's very slight, and it just works just about the same way as we saw before. The lifter pushes on this guy in order to get that out. At the back, though, you can see that we have a little bit of a difference from the previous model in the way the guide pins work, although this guy's just a bit sticky. See that little pin? That's a locator that hits that hole and makes sure that we guide our extractor plate into the right position again. Now, the reason it can't rotate any further than it does is because of flats, see them down in there, that were milled into the sides of that central pin, and then matching ones are in the body of the cylinder. The earlier example, which I don't think I showed you guys very clearly, used full-length indexing pins, or guide pins. So if I push that out, you'll see, yeah, we've got 3 separate full-length pins that go all the way to the cylinder, and then we have a round central pin for the extractor. Obviously, This is a lot more material than the other one. This is a much simpler solution that, yeah, it's metal saved, effort saved. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to try my best to explain this to you, but this gun has haunted my nightmares for many a week because I own the ugly revolver. I bought it through a friend, and I will never regret it because it has revealed to me the depths that you can go to in order to make a revolver work. It's all here, everybody. Everything that you would need. And yet it's in a twisted MC Escher-like spiral. This is unbelievable. But let's see if I can explain it. At the back, we have our bolt lock, and on the top of the trigger, our bolt stop. Same as we've seen before, no confusion there. The main spring, with both its top and bottom, and the arm that powers the stirrup off of the trigger, we saw earlier in this same episode. No confusion there. Where it starts to get a little bit weird is the hand. Now, just like before, the hand does go through that weird trigger extension, and it holds on to the dog by going through there. Okay? It's a very simple looking shape from the outside, almost cartoonish, because its flat bottom is biased by this spring. This is keeping the tension in the right direction and flowing so that it stays in engagement in the cylinder. This flat spring is just sort of wrapped around the pin for the trigger, and then it's stopped on the other side by a pin sticking out of the trigger. Okay, that much we can kind of follow. It looks weird, it's weird shapes, we're good, right? What goes terribly awry is trying to understand essentially the dog in this system, the thing that makes the double action work. If I were to pull this trigger, you might be confused by the fact that the hand is hiding so much in there and assume that we've gone over to a hammer nose style of dog, in which we have some extension engaging on here like you see in most modern revolvers. I will tell you right now, that thing sticking off the front of the hammer, that spring-loaded doodad in there, if I can get in there, it's a bit tight, that is not the dog. It's just a plunger. It's just a rotary plunger that is powered by a spring set inside the hammer. The dog is down here at the bottom, pretty much on the same extension that is the rebound for the hammer. It's swooped sort of underhanded, and it is notched to grab right about there, barely visible. I can also tell you, without you being able to see easily, although we'll have an animation in a moment, that it does have that sort of extended finger like the last model of WG, and therefore as we rotate it's being pushed out of engagement very smoothly until she drops and fires. By the way, not a good idea to frequently allow the hammers to drop under full power on side plate guns with the side plate off. These pins are supposed to be supported at both sides. You don't want them torquing, ruining timing, or destroying your gun. So with this all the way up, you can kind of see the dog in there. If I push him up, you can see him even better. Yeah, see him wiggling back and forth? And then you see this guy here. This spring and plunger, its only job is that when we're all the way down and you can no longer see it because it's behind the hand, is to push this dog that way-ish around so that it does engage back on the hammer so that double action will indeed begin to work. Once engaged on each other, they're sort of hooked together so that spring tension is no longer necessary, so it gets right out of the way anyway. Absolutely bizarre and nightmare fuel to understand the first time I looked in this. Now for single action, the dog isn't involved at all. Instead, we have, let me see if I can get this clear. We just have a projection right in here, that hook off the hammer that engages on the extension off the trigger that wraps around in a Dr. Seuss insane fashion. And therefore, when we cock our back single action, we're just grabbing between the hammer and the trigger like you'd expect. The dog is hanging loose. It's not even under spring tension. It just does whatever it wants at this moment because it's neither helping nor hurting. And then once we get all the way back, we have that sort of lip-to-lip notch. Again, not visible, but we'll see in the animation. And we can pull the trigger and go. This is one of my favorite things that I have ever found by accident. Now, since we have a new lockwork and a fairly confusing one at that, I asked Bruno to give me a hand showing all of you how it works in detail. I hope he's okay.
Much of this action is carried over from our 1889, so we won't go through everything all over again. Instead, let's focus on the key changes. The first is the hand, which is pinned to the trigger and works the same way, but now it has its own dedicated flat spring, which is curiously wrapped around the trigger pin and restrained by an extension off the trigger stirrups pin. The hand's flat bottom is actually designed to keep it biased forward as it travels upward, keeping it in contact with the cylinder. The strangest change is to the dog, which has gone from an overhand push type to an underhand pull type. Simply pull the trigger to drag along the hammer until the dog loses contact and the hammer is free to fall. Now you might wonder, what keeps the dog pressed upwards against the hammer? Well, that would be this spring and plunger set fitted to the hammer. That's not a hammer nose that we're used to. Instead, this tilting finger just keeps pressure on the opposite side of the dog, thereby biasing the dog's lower end into the hammer. Once we pull the trigger, the plunger slowly loses contact, but by then, the dog is hooked on the hammer by tension. This allows the dog to slip off quite naturally, with no spring power at the moment of release. And just to show it, in single action, the dog is basically disengaged the whole time. The hammer and trigger simply meet like before. And there you have it, one of the smoothest and most bizarre looking lockworks we've seen on a revolver.
Now, I decided to hold off on shooting this example for reasons we'll see in a moment. Known advertising for this new model reveals a slightly lowered price, 105 shillings blued or 111 nickeled. During the era of the Model 1882, Webley actually dropped the model number marking on the top strap. Instead, you tend to see them like this one where it just says WG model with no number, or if it has a 6-inch barrel and plain features, you may see WG Army model, or if it's marked as a WG target model, where you'll see in its purest form a 7.5-inch barrel, adjustable sights, and a bell-shaped grip. However, each of these features could be requested singularly, so plenty of examples exist that break the rules. The Model 1892 serials generally run from roughly 4,200 to 6,500, although one example of a Model 1893 is noted to exist around 5,000. This again is a one-off that some collector seems to have stumbled on. It's identical to the Model 1892 except for the firing pin was moved from the hammer to the frame. It may have even been a custom request. After the model name was dropped, another modification was made to the WG Revolver. In 1896, the catch was reinforced, effectively doubled. It was now attached on both sides of the frame, making contact with nearly half of the diameter of the cylinder stud, instead of the previous quarter. At the same time, the patent shows using a smaller screw to stake the catch lever. While this wasn't used in the WG line, it was later added to the service revolvers. Once again, I happen to have one of those here, and the difference is minor enough to skip the light box, so let's take a quick look. So, what collectors know as the model of 1896 only brings one new thing to the table. The fact that this guy also exists on the other side. Yep, he's got a full half sweep, and we're kind of used to this from the military service version of this revolver. There you have it. We have pretty much half of the overall circumference engaged. And of course, it's much bigger and stronger looking. Also, before I forget, I didn't mention it before, but this system also means that we no longer have to orient the arbor, because there is no arbor on the side, before feeding it in. The lifter will work equally on this side of the cylinder as ever, so there's no indexing on your part. You just get to throw this guy in all willy-nilly and then lock her out. Now, I just want to point out, these aren't actually marked 1896. In this case, this one's marked as an Army model. You may see them as a Target or whatever else, but we just call them 1896s when they have the both side locks. I'll also say this has been marked with 3-letter initials in a font or a typography that is common to basically everyone I've seen initialed this way. So it must have been a factory option of some sort. You tend to only see it, though, on the 92 and 96s, at least as far as I've seen. I wouldn't say that that's exclusive, it's just a personal observation. Since this is the last and presumably ultimate WG, let's let Mae take it to the range and see how it compares to the earlier 1889 or 86. Yeah, that's pretty smooth. Later Model 1886 target models received a barrel assembly milling that seems to have been intended to improve balance given the longer barrels. The 1896 would remain Webley's crown jewel revolver until it was replaced by the 1902 WS series. These were just fancied up service revolvers though. I will say, however, they did sort of lead to the much later Mark VI. And to avoid confusion, I'll also point out that Webley & Sons did sell commercial duplicates of their military service revolvers in addition to the WG series. So you had your choice between the rugged Fanu lockwork and the smooth Webley lockwork. Since she's handled both, let's go ahead and now ask Mae her opinion on the Webley governments. All right, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And once again, we have her favorite thing in the world. Revolvers.
Revolvers.
Really big British ones.
Which are all a little slightly different from each other.
There's like a little tiny difference between that one, and we're going to go through the whole thing.
Yeah. It's like an Othais got a hold of it and just went, no, let's tweak it this. No, let's do that.
To be fair, though, this is a hidden evolution. These little changes, I see people all the time who know the absolute difference between an M16A1 versus A2.
Sure.
And because it's in the modern world and we're still arguing about it. Those same changes are perhaps, those changes are smaller than the changes we're seeing even within this family. Mm-hmm. So I think it is fair to discuss this, especially because it's something that's now been abandoned. I mean, this lockwork has long been abandoned. And it has some advantages. I'm not really sure what it would look like to modernize it, but I bet you it would be cool. But anyway, let's just talk about using these, though, because you don't care what's on the inside of these. You just care how they work.
Well, no. I mean, to be fair, I care more that I understand it now. And
Right.
I have the terminology to go with it as well. But as long as they function properly and me as the shooter can utilize them well, sure, I actually do care about that more, technically. You're right.
We're out of order, so I'm going to put these in chronological order for a second.
Okay.
Of the 4, we've only shot 3 because, frankly, this has been a project of love to get it back around to
Project
usable.
of love. And it turns out it still wasn't lovable enough.
It's absolutely perfect now, but
Took too long.
I'm going to be honest with you, we could have filmed it, but I have a feeling when we convert it over to shorts and other things like that, people are going to be like, why does it look like that? Because it's so hideous. I've been calling it Audrey. I don't know if you heard me recording earlier, but it's from...
Audrey?
Yeah, you don't remember the Monty Python? This is my wife, Audrey. She smells a bit, but she's got a heart of gold.
Oh.
That's my baby right
You
here.
realize I didn't see all of Monty Python,
I'm
right?
sorry. Some people did. But let's start chronologically.
Sure.
So we have the 1886 model.
Yep.
This one happened to be a nickel plate, which is why it looks like that now. But at the
Sure.
time, that was a superior coating.
Okay. At the time.
Let's talk just general ergonomics, like picking it up straight off the bat. We would be coming from the Kaufmann world. So
this looks a lot like a Kaufmann,
more
actually.
like this. Yeah, I guess.
Well, it looks a lot like a Kaufmann in general in that we've got similar styles. We've got bird's head grips. We still have a lever top brake opening action. And the hammer's got a really good spur swoop to it. That's kind of pretty common for British revolvers of that day.
I will say, I don't think I mentioned in the episode, they really shortened up the spur, though.
They did.
They just made it more aggressively deep and pop up to get the leverage back up, I guess. I'm not really
I guess
sure.
you can really hook your thumb a lot better into this one, and I don't feel like my thumb is going to inch out of it.
No.
So that's kind of nice.
Even with like a bloody hand, I wouldn't slip off of that thing.
No, but meanwhile that one, taper's a little too soft. Maybe that was the problem. Too much blood on the hands.
I don't tend to hook it. I tend to get at the very end of the Kaufmann. I think that's what you did too. Whereas on this one, I think you tend to hook.
Yeah.
Or that one.
This one, yeah. I could see that. And then, I mean, essentially, there's not much else that doesn't scream British revolvers in this and that. It's got a large frame revolver, really tall front sight, and like I said, the grip and the top brake system itself, those two being very British-esque.
Does this stand out to you versus the Webley service revolvers you've handled?
Not especially.
Just the grip.
Honestly, in general, yes. The grip itself is not very comfortable. It's not my favorite.
No, but we've dealt with the round back grips. It's just the military ones tend to be beefier, which I don't even know if that's better, actually. I think
it's
I might...
kind of bulbousy, I've noticed.
When we get back around to those, because we're going to cover them again in much better detail now, I'd like you to give me a comparison between the sort of commercial narrow grip and the military slightly chubbier grip, you know?
Yeah. And if you notice, there's actually a kind of a taper down here to the grip itself. So it's narrow at the top, but it's actually kind of really fat at the bottom, at the base.
Now, you've complained before in the Kaufmann about not having that palm support at the back. Is that still true? You're not a bird's head fan?
I'm in general not a bird's head fan, but I kind of like the taper on this one. I think they actually tapered a little bit ergonomically nicer for the hand.
Sure.
Which is kind of good.
All right, so you like the latch.
Sure.
You like the grips okay compared to the Kaufmann.
Slight improvement. I'm going to give a slight improvement.
You've always been a fan of these tall sights.
Yep.
You've got top brake action.
Which is rapid ejection / pretty easy for access for quick loading.
Okay.
Can't argue with that.
What about, I guess, okay, so we've loaded up. That was easy, I assume?
Yeah, pretty much. It's pretty straightforward for that. No real issue with popping it and opening it.
Right. Now, you notice it didn't eject this time. Mm-hmm. That's because, again, this one has a broken spring. So when we were filming, we'd have to get it in position and shake it and make sure that the thing dropped down so that Mae could then break it open and have it work correctly.
A little bit of movie magic there.
That spring was quickly abandoned for a much more reliable coil spring in the next model.
Yep.
So the real question of this gun is actually down to the trigger. Because, yes, there's some visual differences in terms of how they formed up the front of the gun and everything. Mm-hmm. They've gone backwards in time to get rid of this push button to the old Kone style release. But it's really the trigger that makes the difference. So let's start with single action first. How's that doing for you?
Let's see. How's that doing? What did they do to that hammer? Why is it as heavy as it is? It kind of doesn't feel like it makes sense. Right, I've seen this broken open.
Cock that open? Or cock that back, rather?
Yeah, cock it back. God, it is stiff. That has to be one of the stiffest hammers that I've handled today.
This was our latest model Kaufmann. So late, as a matter of fact, that it has gone back to the Kone, which is a little weird.
I don't remember this being... Yeah, no, this is light as heck.
Yeah.
It's incredibly light.
It is a totally different lockwork as well. As a matter of fact, I'm concerned with how light the Kaufmanns are. I'm wondering if there were complaints about misfires from not being able to strike hard enough. Mm-hmm. Because that thing has a very dialed up hammer. And as a matter of fact, it looks like for the double action, they were trying very hard to overcome having a very heavy hammer for reliable impact by adding all this leverage to the system to try to really give you a big pull on your double action.
Were there having issues with primers being popped? Was that an issue?
I can't find any documentation of that.
Okay.
But the problem is this is all commercial. And commercial entities tended to hide their failures. We have to
really did.
We have to sniff out their failures by seeing what they changed because clearly they're adapting to something. Just like we saw with the Kaufmanns.
It's basically like if you were to take a puzzle and all of a sudden a few pieces have been changed a little bit, you have to go, well, wait, why is this different now?
If we hadn't had a Kaufmann that blew open on us, then...
We would have not thought to look for that change.
No, we would have thought to, because when we saw that change happened, it's in the literature.
Okay. We
would have assumed that they must have had blow open problems. And it turns out they did.
Well, that's true. You probably would have come to that.
I probably would have assumed that they had out of battery blow open problems. I would not have assumed they had blow open problems. But
that was special.
Yeah. So heavy hammer pull back. You didn't actually talk about the brake on that though. So if you single action that back.
Yeah.
And then, I know. Yeah, I'm sorry. How soft is that release?
I mean, it's actually pretty soft. It's actually pretty gentle. It's not bad. It's just...
You're not throwing any aim on
it. No. It's barely it's actually a pretty light touch off, I would say, for a single action.
I want to say, it's been a little bit since I've handled this guy, but... Oh, yeah.
Yeah, see, it's actually not bad. It's pretty good.
It's a little soft, but boy, it's right there.
90% suffer, 10% actually pretty crisp.
All right, so let's talk about double action now.
Sure.
Because the entire idea behind this is to have the smoothest possible double action revolver. Is it actually smooth?
Yeah, okay. They actually did an okay job on that. The trigger itself does feel pretty smooth on the pull through. Now,
just okay with a heavy hammer?
That's my thing. You would think, oh, it's going to be terrible. No, for some reason, it feels disproportionate, actually. If anything, it highlights the hammer more because you think, well, why is the trigger actually kind of nice, medium weight pull through and pretty clean? Meanwhile, the hammer is, God knows, that hard to pull back. It doesn't make sense.
I think you're thinking of it backwards.
What do you mean?
Because remember, we had the Colt 1878, especially the O2 Philippine.
Sure.
Where they dialed the crap out of that hammer to make sure they got reliable ignition.
No one's going to forget that boy.
And then to overcome it, they ended up adding more trigger, but then more trigger got in the way, so they curled the trigger, and then you didn't have more trigger anymore. Uh-huh. So, granted, this has a fairly pronounced trigger. I mean, it's not really any bigger than the old model, though.
No, I wouldn't say it is.
Instead, it appears that they've gone ahead and they've leveraged as much as they can mechanically by wrapping everything around and really getting that distance and that pull, and they're squeezed everything in there.
So there's like a longer pull happening there that's kind of putting me off for that?
It's basically they're trying to take as much mechanical advantage as they can, and they're also having the even in addition to taking the mechanical advantage that they're getting, they're trying to get the sear to kick itself over instead of just sort of being driven off. Or how do I play it? Instead of just flicking off, the sear is being very carefully pushed by both itself and the other object to separate very smoothly. And so what you get is an almost complete lack of stack. Now, there is
it's like a near seamless transition that's happening in there.
Right. And this isn't like a later French, roller bearing whatever, where they've really tried to eliminate stack. But this is as close to that as you're going to get, especially for how old this is. It's actually really impressive.
Yeah, for 86, that's quite impressive. You're not wrong.
I mean, if you pull that again, where's the lope? Do you feel it? Do you feel anything different than the next thing until all of a sudden, snick?
Yeah, it kind of just goes to snick.
Yeah. Now, the problem is, it's a bit of a... I would call that a medium pull. What do you think?
Yeah, it's about medium. That's the thing that's why I said this one's medium. Meanwhile, the hammer itself is hard. So I'm thinking, how do they manage to get that sort of difference in it? And I'm wondering if they did something in here that actually did just lengthen the trigger pull to kind of help leverage that out.
Yeah, it's all about the engagement not being so... We're so accustomed to having a dog that is a hammer nose right off the front. And you just sort of hit that thing and you shove over center. And you don't have a lot of mechanical advantage there. Whereas this is like, okay, we're going to come from the very outside of the hammer as far as we can get over.
Yeah, and it's just going to be a slow transition to where it slips off.
We've wrapped all around our axis pin and then come up again so that we're pulling all the way around this structure.
Right.
And so we're just got a big weird shaped lever.
It's impressive in there.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, with that extremely heavy hammer, you end up with a good but not amazing trigger pull.
Right. What
about our 1889? And there's a good reason we had her shoot this one, because technically, internally, these are the same in their lock work.
Identical, or?
The only difference is the way the arbor is retained between these two examples. The way the arbor is retained.
Yep, I see it's got those long pins.
No, that's in there. It's literally the cross screw.
Oh, just the cross screw itself.
You saw this one try to shake loose.
Yeah.
You don't want to be shooting it a bunch of times and then have it just pop off.
Nah.
So the arbor retention is different, and then on this particular one and that one, this has a coil spring operated chock, which is the thing that drives out the extractor. That one was a flat spring that broke out. Well, until you go to open it, you're not going to know the difference between those two. But otherwise, they're the same, except this one is in unbelievably mint condition for its age.
It is kind of ridiculous in how clean
you're talking like 100 and... somewhere close to 140 years or so.
Yeah, this was a fun find.
Yeah. Now, that thing also has, from your perspective, the improved target grips.
Yes.
So I guess first things first, how do those grips feel compared to the bird's head?
Yeah, they are actually insanely comfortable. I'm not going to lie. So coming off the bird's head, practically there are a lot of things that I would pick over bird's heads, don't get me wrong. However, these are actually pretty fantastic. The bell right here kind of settles nicely into the center of your palm. The when it actually comes out to the base, it cushions underneath, almost like a Colt single action.
Okay. 1873.
Yeah. Thank you. The only thing I wish they had changed is the knuckle up here. It does nothing. The knuckle does nothing.
No, grab it tight by the knuckle.
Ah.
Now point.
I'm gonna get him.
Naturally point.
Ah.
Yeah, hi. Every time. British revolvers. I don't know
why. I guess if I'm hip firing, that's not a bad angle.
We have had one knuckle in the right spot in all of our British history, which was one of the Lancasters, the 2-barrel, I believe.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And it was just, boom. Oh, wow, okay, this is what
perfect.
Why can't the rest do this?
No. Apparently that was the only acceptable one for the knuckle.
I genuinely believe it's because of hip fire at this point. But I've never been able to find anybody actually tell me that's why. And I know people are thinking, oh, that's crazy. They didn't necessarily hip fire all the time back then. But no, the training for World War II still included hip firing like this. And if you had a knuckle that forced your hand lower, you'd have a hard time just sort of draw and dump.
He hasn't released the videos on it yet, but I think Rob from British Muzzleloaders actually does some good hip fire demonstration.
Yeah, he hasn't done that project, which I really want him to, because that was fun.
Yeah.
But we did actually put him through hip fire testing, which he hated because he doesn't do a lot of handgun shooting. But I really do believe It's that, you know? Because that's why double action. As a matter of fact, I suspect that if you were to talk to these British revolver guys back in the day and go, why didn't you do the knuckle better so that when I'm here and I'm pulling for double action, they'd probably go, if you're at full extension, you're aiming, why are you double action? Right. If you have time for full extension, why aren't you single action firing, in which we've positioned it so that it's like a single action army, like you just said. And then when you're here at the hip, you're double actioning because you're in a hurry, boom, boom, boom.
Right.
I have nowhere in the literature where that's been said, but I've also had nowhere where it's been explained at all. And it's the most likely scenario in my head.
I'm curious to see if anyone had some primary source on that. That'd be interesting.
It's that, or they really suck at picking where to put the knuckle.
Oh, yeah. Maybe
those are the two options.
I never figured it out.
If anybody ever finds documentation on this, please let me know. I would love to prove this out.
Now, realistically, objectively, aside from the grip, there's not a lot of differences other than obvious external beauty, the change in the screw, and the grip itself. You'd think it would just be pretty much the same then. I actually prefer the hammer on this one. It's lighter. It feels still pretty smooth by comparison. I would say both of them are both pretty smooth hammers, but this one's lighter and easier to actuate.
I have no idea if that has to do with the target grips, but I will say we have 2 guns here with target grips, 2 guns here with bird's head grips, and the 89 and the 92 that have the target grips have lighter hammers.
Now, it's
a sample size of 4.
I would probably say maybe that had something to do with it. If I was extending it and actually utilizing the grip in my hand like normal shooting, then I would say maybe that is affecting it. However, I'm just sitting here working it, and it feels different. It just naturally feels different. I'm not using the grip that much at all.
Right.
Not how I normally would be for shooting it anyway.
So the single action was nicer to cock.
Yep.
Was the trigger pull any different, or was it nice and glassy? Well, you're doing double.
It's glassy.
You're doing double.
Sorry. Well, okay. Yeah, sorry. All right. Now, no real difference. It's actually just as crisp, I would say.
Good single action.
Yep, good single action
trigger. And then you already gave away the double. Yeah. Oh my
God, so smooth. So glassy.
Is this your reaction to that when we were on range? Because, you know, I make Mae suffer through a lot of things.
It's true. He really does.
You had the best reaction to that we've had since the Swiss 1878.
It's because it was just so surprising that actually you handed it to me, you know, oh, it looks gorgeous. Another British revolver. It's going to suck. Because it's what always happens. There's always something lopiness to it. There's an awful trigger. There's an awful something creaky in the system. Or it's a revolver in general. It's going to fall apart.
Right.
No. It performed. It was like glass. It was beautiful all the way through the shoot. So I, as a shooter, just got to have a nice time for a change with a revolver.
Would you rank that actually legitimately high in your double action revolvers? Can you think of a double action revolver that was smoother than this?
It's hard to do that off the top of my head, but I can't think of one immediately.
No, I'd have to. We'd be in triple lock territory. And you're talking about much later for the triple lock to come out.
Yeah, you're thinking like, what was that, 1913?
I'm trying to remember now. It would have been... Oh, crap. Don't test me on that. My dates are all messed up. The problem is triple lock gets involved in the war in 1914, 15, so that's what I tend to think of.
Right.
But it is a pre-war design.
That's what I was thinking.
You've already turned
just pre-war.
You've turned the century, and I'm going to argue that might be... I don't know about lighter, because the hammer's the hammer spring's different.
So is it potentially this one's the best of its century, then?
This gun might be the smoothest double action I have laid hands on, short of like an MR73. And then the weight is where it confuses me, because, you know, you don't always have the same hammer strength per trigger pull. So if this thing had a spring as light as a triple lock, I would probably find it to be better than a triple lock in terms of double action pull, if I had to say, to give you guys an idea.
Fair.
So Webley's goal of having a smooth double action was definitely realized. It's actually really impressive. Well, and I find it funny that
they realized it as early as they did with the 86 even. That's still a really good trigger pull.
Yeah, nobody talks about this with these guns, which is really weird to me, because it's a hidden gem.
To be fair, it's possible that they're not handling pieces that are actually in decent working condition. Or that might be the...
They might not be told. They must be like, oh, that's very smooth. But again, the hammer weight's so high, even on the Lighten one, that it still feels like a heavy double action. Yeah. Because that's what the cartridges required at the time. So, I don't know. Let's keep moving. We're going to skip the 92 for a moment because we didn't fire that one.
Technically didn't fire it.
Let's go straight to the 96 then.
Okay.
Now, the big advantage to this one externally is that you can release the cylinder more easily, and when you go to reinsert the cylinder, you don't have to index it into the correct position to line up with the lifter. So, kudos there.
Sure.
Then, internally, we've changed. We now have, instead of a push dog, we have a pull dog.
Why?
It's back to the 1886 in terms
Bad
of
dog
hammer.
is what it should be called.
Well, hold on, that's not the dog. You're cogging back manually.
No, yeah.
So I guess you're kind of giving it away. How's the single action?
Not my favorite. I'm trying to think
Heavy hammer?
like this better or worse than the 86.
Okay, so wait, the hammer's heavy.
Yeah, the hammer's heavy.
What about the pulling the trigger when the hammer's back? Is that smooth and easy? No, not double action.
No, I'm just doing this. Sorry, I just already had
You're getting ahead of me.
I am getting a little heavy. Hold on.
You keep
All
not.
right.
You are so obsessed with how heavy the hammers are to cog. You're not telling us the single action pull.
You know, I will say it's still just as nice as the rest of them. Very crisp, very smooth. There's not much to it.
All right, now let's do the double action.
I would argue it's just as smooth as the others, but am I going further back? It feels like the travel on this one's longer somehow.
I actually had the same feeling.
Wait, did we measure that? Because I'd be curious. It feels like I'm just going further back into the trigger guard than what I was expecting.
Every time I pull on this gun, I find that I have to tuck my finger more than on the other one. So I started comparing.
Oh yeah, that one's not as far.
No. Watch. Look at the release point. So I know you guys can't see it at home very easily, but it's right there, right at the end.
That's pretty far.
Now let's try this one.
That one's not as far. I just looked
for those of you at home, about a centimeter off the back of the trigger guard. And then in this case, we're about 2 or 3 centimeters off the back of the trigger guard.
Yep. And this one... Actually, not as far. This one's like somewhere between this one and that one.
Yeah. So I think it may just be a variance within the firearms themselves. But I will say both this and by dry working this 1892, because I haven't had a chance to shoot it, both of them make me feel like I have to tuck my finger more than the earlier ones. And there may actually be some more draw in that new lockwork.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'd have to sit down and really measure it, but I do think that you're actually having to tuck the hand more to fire this one.
Now, my thing is that I don't feel like I've lost or gained any smoothness in that trigger pull itself. It kind of feels very comparable to these guys.
I've tried to sit here, and especially with this guy who's a little rough and the other guy that was a little rough, I've tried to sit here and actually dry fire in and see if I can pick up a difference.
Can you?
I suspect that what I am feeling is that, so you have this massively heavy hammer on this one. As a matter of fact, probably heavier than the 1886. Let me see. Yeah, it's a little heavier.
Okay.
If I pull this trigger, it's fairly light despite that heavy hammer. I would get to a sort of a medium pull. If I pull this trigger, it's the same. The problem is the hammer is heavier. So I think, once again, we're getting lost in the weight of the system and not the smoothness of the system. I do think there's more mechanical leverage in the updated system, and therefore it gets quite smooth. Now for the gun that we didn't shoot, may I ask you to dry fire that double action. So don't even ride the hammer, let's just feel it out.
Wow, that is very light by comparison.
I do think the drag link helps.
Wow, yeah, okay.
Now, what this is probably intended for is double action target shooting, which I don't believe was done at the hip, so I'm still confused by the knuckle.
I thought you said internally this one was like that one.
They are.
Well, then why is the hammer on this one so much nicer?
Well,
it's light.
Again, we said it earlier, the ones that have the target grips, for whatever reason, have lighter hammers in this sampling. Overall, in the whole world, I kind of doubt it, but it's just weird that...
It makes me think someone's gone in there and done something to make them actual better target shooters.
Well, that one's been cleaned up 6 ways from Sunday because I've been slowly trying to put it back to working order. But no, it's ugly, but like I said, heart of gold. I do think that the drag link is an improvement, but it's such a minor one that clearly Webley was going after the target shooting community and we're trying to win by fractions of an ounce.
Maybe this was how they were trying to talk people into the extra 6 pence kind of thing, or 6 shillings.
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, just be like, oh no, it's so much nicer. The grips really make you think that there's a big difference when there's not. And joke's on you, there is.
It's kind of odd that this was abandoned, to be honest with you, except for the fact that it's extremely complex. Especially going from even between these two, just having that weird hammer, breast, spring, and plunger system. they did a lot to make this gun as smooth as humanly possible at that time. And then apparently, I think what they did is they got caught in a discount spiral, which is that the market doesn't always want a high end.
Right.
Sometimes, that's not sustainable. And people go, well, I want the Militaria one. I want the Militaria one. And the Militaria one was a Fanu lockwork, which, as much as I love Fanus for being sort of the modern revolver, we've seen a lot of companies struggle after the fact, like Colt and Smith & Wesson, to sort of rewind the Fanus in order to get rid of the spring stack that's inherent in those. Those are lockworks that are designed to be simple. They're not designed to be smooth. Mm-hmm. And so they tend to have a beginning, middle, and end. This is just the song that never ends. It goes straight on, my friend.
That's fair.
So
that's a good comparison, actually.
All right. Overall, with the WGs, how do you feel about them?
It's interesting. The target shooters are hands down my favorite just because they have the smoothest actions. The hammers on them tend to be the lightest ones. And for me personally, as a shooter, I was handling them much better.
I'm surprised.
If I had shot that one, I actually wish I had shot this one because I think that would have been my favorite.
I'm sorry.
You screwed up.
I am a huge fan of these. It's a big bore 6-shot top break rapid loader. Mm-hmm. Now they should have been fairly gone by the time of the Great War. You're talking, that by 1902 they're being replaced. You've got over another decade. It's not that there were none. It's just that they would have been private arms that somebody dragged along. They're not being bought for the Great War. And that tends to be how we think about the military stuff of that period. Mm-hmm. There's sort of a pre-Great War, post-everything else gun.
And then I can appreciate the extents they went to actually try to make these things smoother as well.
Oh, yeah,
like
they're
great. The changing up what the dog was and essentially that drag instead. That's genius.
Yeah. Now, my problem is for military use, they're way too complicated. Mm-hmm. That lockwork is utter insanity. No military would ever adopt that lockwork.
Was there a lot of hand fitting that went into them?
I'm sure there was. The interchangeable parts is never as interchangeable as you want them to be. So there's no way field armorers would want to support these things. Now, I, as a private purchase officer, would I buy one? Absolutely, yes. And I'd probably buy it over the later models that come up that have Fanu lockworks.
Fair.
Because of, and this is just my experience, so it's not worth very much, but I've yet to come across one of these that was truly broken. What tends to be wrong, like this one, what tended to be wrong with it was that it had a damaged spring, like the minor spring.
Sure.
And then like something was missing. Mm-hmm. Like a part was just gone. And then I got another parts one in, and I've handled 2 other parts ones. And it's always stuff's just gone. Like people just took it out of the gun for whatever reason. It's usually exterior parts. Mm-hmm. But the lockworks themselves never seem to show signs of marring or cracking or being beat up. But again, it's a very small sample in my case. However, there's lots of other stuff that I've encountered that in very small numbers, and I always find problems with them.
Sure.
So, yes, it's just from my perspective, but at the moment, my trust for these, despite their complexity, is actually fairly high.
They appear actually to be very robust.
Yeah, if I could get target grips on the later 1896 with that full support for the cylinder when you're breaking it open, I would be a very happy camper, even all the way through the Great War.
Was that an option for that one?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact,
I didn't know if they continued the option.
I don't think you were here when we were filming that part. They literally cut the frame here and they cut the frame there, and they throw in a strap and weld it in, and
those.
then
That's smart. A little seam. It's still there, but practically seamless.
it's very seamed. All right, raving reviews for this.
You know what? For a smattering of revolvers you've had me shoot for a single episode, this was probably one of the best smatterings I've had to handle to date.
So we do have an executive producer for this episode.
We do?
Although he doesn't know it. I'm just forcing him to be the executive producer.
Oh.
It's my friend Tombus. Tombus, you're the executive producer on this episode because I know you're going to watch it. Now, he's moved away and abandoned me.
He has left you.
Yes.
He doesn't love you anymore.
I will miss you, my dearest friend, who I will probably never see again, even though you're 3 hours away.
We technically have one more, I think, for this episode, don't we?
Oh, yeah. We have the same man for all of the British stuff for a long time to come.
He has claimed them.
Mr. Andy Wade.
Andy Wade,
who has single-handedly saved this show from disaster.
In the time we needed it at the most, that came in handy. So that man has a full claim on all British episodes we are doing right now.
For anyone curious, we are knee-deep into a big project to redo the studio and some other things to make the show easier and to bring more to our patrons.
Yes.
If you are not a patron, that is a $1 commitment per month, $1, in order to get access to the podcast. And then, frankly, the behind the scenes podcast will tell you what episodes are coming up next. And then you can turn it off if you don't want to hear us run our mouths. But you could also hear the struggles of us trying to actually lock this show in and then build it up into something that you guys will really enjoy.
And occasionally he rambles on for like 20 minutes about some old man thing he hates.
You can also hear about scooters and all sorts of weird stuff.
Yeah, tractor times.
Oh, that's coming up soon. All right. With all that covered, we'll catch you guys on the next episode.
Night, everybody. But we got it done, and then everything's all set up for power and the AC, which was kind of nice because our neighbor basically got all that set up, and he did all the duct work and stuff like that. Realistically, I've just been his helper, and then the only thing I've really done is put the insulation in there.
He said you're his favorite helper he's ever had.
Which is kind of sad.
He actually approached me about it first. He goes, who taught her to work like that? And I went, work like what? And he's going, she's the best helper I've ever had. She predicts what we're doing and gets ahead of me, and sometimes reminds me stuff I didn't even remember. Mm-hmm. And I went, it's probably from working on the show, because
It's working with you.
I don't have the best memory as it is. I'm often moving pretty quickly. But also, you did sports and stuff. You were coached a lot as a kid, so
yeah. But I can't say I necessarily had it ingrained in me to try to think that far ahead when it came to switching gears for different little plate spinning projects rapidly. That was all working with you, so that's what I told him too. I was like, oh, I did, because I paused. He asked me. I paused for a second. I went, from Othais? I'm pretty sure it's just from him.
Honestly, my real favorite, it's almost like a treat now, is when you go, they're like, you know what that is? And you're like, yeah, it's a nice looking Type 38. It looks like a late pattern, you know?
Uh-huh. So it clearly shows not only you know the gun, but you know some bits about it to identify that.
No, that's a Japanese Ariska. And you go, oh, okay, thank you. Like, they correct you. And the guys wonder why I won't correct them. It's like, there's no point. They're not listening.
I haven't heard of Ariska in quite some time.
You think there's still data coming in. There's only data coming out.
Yeah.
Who the hell wants to look at pictures of people eating at the restaurant that they're eating at? It feels so... It's like putting the FN on the FN 1900 on the logo for the FN 1900 grips.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm just going... Of all the things I want to watch in the restaurant, if I wanted to watch people eating food in the restaurant, I could just look around the restaurant because there's other people here. And then we can remove the base. By the way, that fouling is because this gun was range fresh when we filmed this bit. Now with all that off, we can saddle back and throw the lever to open up the feed block cover, allowing us to lift out the feed block itself. This works just like the old Maxim.